Hello and welcome to Unlocking LLM Potential, a journey with APIs. My name is Ricardo Covo, and I'm a principal consultant on the app dev and modernization practice at CenturyLogic. My LinkedIn is my main form of social media, so please feel free to reach out if you want to connect. Today, we're going to be following this agenda. I'm going to do first an environment overview. I'm going to show you what I'm going to be using during the presentation. There's going to be a lot of demos. We're going to come and cover the basics just so we have common terminology and understanding. We're going to follow that with a demo. Then we're going to go into the meat of it, which is chat competition with tools. So tools, APIs, functions are tools that you can augment the chat with. And then there is a new feature, at least on the Azure OpenAI, which is the assistant. And I'll cover a little bit. I'll do a small overview, but a lot of the concepts will translate into that. So environment, we're going to be using OpenAI as our AI service. I have some sample web APIs that I'm going to use. And then there is a Visual Studio project that we're going to be working with to develop this project. So let's check that out. So from the Azure perspective, so I am using an OpenAI service. Once you go into it, it's gonna ask you to go to the Azure AI Studio to actually do your work. So I'm gonna click on that. A brand new browser is gonna open. It's kind of like a different tool. So we're gonna give it a little second for it to load. And one of the things that you can start looking in here is if I go into resource management, keys and endpoints, this is pretty much the service, the endpoint of the service, and the keys that I'm going to have to feed my client on the code to actually have access to this functionality. On OpenAI Studio, here's where you have your chat, your completions, the assistants that we're gonna, so the different services that are available from OpenAI, but also important is the models. So you can deploy different type of models. So I have deployed only a GPT-35 Turbo is more than enough for the demo that we're gonna be doing. So this name is important because from the code, I will also reference. So that's what you need to know here from the Azure part. From the web API, the sample web API that I created is in a container app. And we're going to simulate creating timesheets for a project or projects. So I've called it Timesheets API. And here in Postman, you can see how I can get the different projects. Or I could add hours to a project. So getting the project is a simple get. It's taking a little bit because it's probably a cold. In the container app, I have it set up that it can go up to 0 instances. So it takes a little bit to come up, but you can see here that it returned an array of projects. In adding hours to a project involved doing a post with a certain payload and a certain specific URL. So this is what we're eventually gonna be using, and those are the two things that you need to know. Like in Azure, is where you have your endpoint, your keys, and your deployment. And from Postman, this is how I can test the APIs. Let's go now and show you Visual Studio. So I have an application running that it looks like this. It's like the simplest chat you've ever seen. And then we're going to be playing with some code here. It's a Blazor application that is already running, but that's what we're going to be using for the demo. All right, so let's continue here. So some basics. So the service is whatever service is providing the LLM. It could have been deployed locally, or it could be, in this case, I'm going to be using Azure OpenAI, but it could go on the chat on OpenAI itself. And then when you to use that service, you kind of create a client on your code and initiate it with some options. The chat is kind of the conversation that is happening. Roles are who is participating on that conversation. It could be the system is kind of like the assistant setup, and then so the end user is a user, the assistant is the reply coming from the service, and then tool and functions is another type of role that you can have, and we will get into. So when you are having a conversation with this chat, you send a request message that includes the role, the content, and the history. And then the service is going to send you back a response message, and it has the response content and some other indicators. For example, whether you need to call functions. So this is how typically a chat conversation will start. A user will say something to the application, and the first thing this application is going to say is, I'm going to set up my system, and the system is context that you're giving to this chat conversation. And in this case, you're setting up the system to be a helpful assistant. And then what is the actual message that the user is sending is hi there. Now, the service is going to respond to you with some answer. In this case, how can I help? Now, on your next step, you want to say, hey, I want ideas for a talk on Gen AI. Well, you have to send all the conversation back into the service, because remember, the service, if you don't provide them a context, then they're not really smart. They respond based on a context that you're providing. So you have to send all the conversation if you want the conversation to evolve in a natural way. All right, so let's look at a demo. And the demo is going to look like this. So the code that we're going to look actually generates to this. So there is a space for the conversation, an input, and a submit and a reset. So let's look at the code. I'm going to collapse some of the things. You can see here the conversation is going to loop through messages and display them. And then down here is where you have your prompt, and you either send a prompt or reset the chat. Right away, I can tell you that reset the chat is basically eliminating all the history of the messages that you have, and that basically means a new conversation. But let's see what happens when the page is started. I'm gonna read the endpoint and the key from the configuration file, and I'm gonna initiate my client. Now, when I send the prompt, I'm gonna do some state management here. I'm going to actually display the message. But here is where I say, hey, from my API client, get a chat completions async. Now, chat completions is a very specific terminology. If I go back to here, you can say here completion, right? So that's kind of what you're initiating over there. So I'm going to go back and see that to initiate that, I'm building a chat completion option. This is important because this is where you actually set up your your assistant for your conversation. You're gonna say the deployment name is GPT-35. Remember in Azure AI Studio, I had that deployment name. And I'm setting the system message. And here I went a little funny with it and say you are a helpful assistant that is obsessed with cookies, right? So it's very simple setup. But I'm also here, if there is any messages on that conversation, I'm gonna actually set them as messages on the options. So I am sending that context back. So that is basically the base use case. So I can say hello there. Uh, right now, oh, there he goes. So you say, how can I assist you today? Are you in need some cookie related? So it's showing the cookie thing right on my face, even though I had no context for it. Why are you talking about cookies? I submit that, and it's just gonna respond in some way. So I'm just gonna reset that, and it's gonna clear the chat. All right, let's go back to the presentation. So we introduced the concept of tools, and it basically gives the chat, the assistants that you're creating, access to tool like code interpreter or knowledge retrieval. But it also is, and more importantly for the context of this presentation, is allowing me to build tools using my own function calling. In here, what would happen is I'm still going to send a system configuration, the message from the user, but in addition, I'm going to send it some tools. And those tools are going to define the functions that I am providing to the assistant. The assistant is smart to know that you need to call some functions. So it's going to say, hey, you need to call functions, and it's going to give you an ID that you can use for that you will use for reference. Now, you know that you need to call functions, so you do call the functions. So the service is not going to call your APIs or your functions on its own. It's going to tell you to call it, and then you perform the actual function calling and give them a response. So when you respond to it, you're going to say, hey, I did call this function with this ID, and this is the response. And then it's going to generate a natural language response. In this case, you're asking what projects do I have? So imagine if you're doing your timesheets, you first need to know, hey, what projects are available to me? And then you add hours to it. So that's the first thing that we're going to do is going to ask, what projects do I have? And then it's going to tell me, hey, you need to call a function for that. And I'm going to call the function, and I'm going to tell the assistant what the response was. And then it's going to send me a nice natural language response for it. All right. So let's look at the demo for that. It's very similar to the previous one that I have. You can see it's the same kind of chat. But in here, when I am defining my completion, now I went a little more um, serious, like standard with it. You're a helpful assistant. You will help employees fill their timesheets. But when it's time to define the tools, I'm going to say, hey, there is a gets projects function. And a definition kind of looks like this. It has its own type. And then you give it the name of the project, give it a nice description. That's kind of like the prompt it's kind of like the hint that we're giving the assistant of when to use this particular function. So you here will define in this case there are no properties that are required for this particular function. So I have configured my chat to know that there is a gets project functions. The rest kind of remain the same. I'll show you this when we call it. Uh, the 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 other difference is when I'm processing the chat completion, I'm gonna look for the finish reason on the response. And if it's tool calls, that means that the assistants have determined that you need to make some calls. And then you actually have to go ahead and do that call yourself. So what I'm going to do is put a stop sign around here. And I'm just going to go and say, hello. You can see here the finish reason. If I go into here, hopefully, let's do this here. If you go up, sorry, that didn't work very well. But if you go into here, you can say that we have a finish reason stop. That means you have nothing to do, just continue running. And yeah, how can I assist you today? And I'm just gonna ask it, can you show me my project, please? All right, so now if I do the same thing, the finish reason is, hey, you have some tools to call. So it's gonna go in here. It's gonna do some management of the state, and then you can have multiple tool calls. So I put them on a for each, and this function right here is gonna process that call. So I think I'm gonna put a stop sign right here now, and I can see here that the function that I need to call, I'm gonna say, hey, is if projects function, get project functions, and it is. And here we have successfully called a function. So it's just that right now I have it hard coded just to show you the different stages. When you set up functions, it's up to you how the function gets executed. It could be executed in line, like in here, or it could be a DLL call, or it could be some a web API call, which is what we eventually want to do. So in here, I'm just saying I'm just simulating that this is gonna be my response, and I have to send back the tool call ID because that's how the assistant is gonna reconcile. It's gonna say, "Hey, I asked you to do something. Did you do it or not?" So when I go back, you say. It went back again, and this time it was stop. So it was project blue, green, and yellow. So it is exactly what I have here, right? So that is basically our first iteration in calling a function call. All right, so let's continue here. So I have changed. So I've been doing this I pause the recording and do it so it's faster. But I have changed to my branch of API function call. And in here, what I want to show you is that the get projects, it kind of remains the same. There's no change here that is going to do anything. But I did added a second function, a second tool definition. And what this does is add hours to projects. This is the description. And again, if you can craft the description in a way that is very, very descriptive with little words, that's going to be best because you're not going to use as many tokens as otherwise you would. But in here, I do have to define parameters, and it is an object. It has a project ID, a project number, a number of hours, a description, and an entry date. Oh, and here I want to show you that when I set up my system, I actually gave him context on what the day would what the current date is, because I'm gonna be saying things like, please add 2 hours for projects X for today, and he needs to know what today is. If you don't set this up, the assistant, if I think it gives a weird 2022 kind of date. So make sure that you set up the right context for that. And in this, so this is the required fields are hours, description, and entry date. So pretty much anything, everything. Project ID in truth should be one. Then the chat completion. I am now giving multiple tools for it to be able to determine what to call. And let me show you here what happens when the function name is equal to get project functions. What it's gonna do is gonna go, and I just have a very quick get projects implementation. It's just an HTTP client. It's an API wrapper, HTTP client. It goes into projects and does a response. But if it is add hours to project name, it actually goes and sends all the arguments, because get projects didn't have arguments, but add hours to projects does have arguments. And the function call, which is something that is coming from the chat completion, actually try to determine what the arguments were, and it's good. And I'm just gonna send it to my project. And what I'm gonna do that, because these arguments are gonna come as a JSON, I created a small add hours model. I'm gonna deserialize into that, and I'm just gonna make the right URL and post it. So get projects is a get, and add hours to project is a post. The rest kind of remain the same. So let's see how that works. I'm gonna go in here and I'm gonna say, what projects are available to me? So this is kind of the same that we did before. It's gonna say, hey, you need a function call, and it's gonna go and say, yes, you probably need the get projects results, and this is gonna go and hit my API. It's gonna take a little bit, I guess. And if you see the project results, you can see here that I'm saying Phoenix, Griffin, Kraken is what we saw in in the call over here. Phoenix, Griffin, and Kraken. And I'm just gonna let it go now and see what what happens. The next time that it comes, the finish reason is going to be stop because there was a function call and I already did it. I send it back. So now I go here and say, hey, these are the projects that are available for you. All right. So I'm going to say something like add 2 hours to project Phoenix. There you go. Phoenix for today. I'm going to submit it. And it's going to say, hey, you have some functions to call. So I'm going to go inside of tool call response message. In here is going to say, yes, you need to add hours to the project. And then here is something very cool that I want to show. So even though I said add projects to Phoenix, because I'm sending all the context and it has all the information, it knows that the ID for Phoenix is 1. It knows that I'm saying 2 hours. I didn't put a description, so it just said working on task. And entry date is today. So I'm just gonna close this and let it go, and it's gonna go. Okay, so let me just not stop here. I'll just go. It's gonna come back, and the finish reason now is gonna be stop. So let's see. Hey, 2 hours have been successfully added to Project Phoenix for today. Let's do another add an hour to Kraken for yesterday. Description should be working on weekend. So let's see what that does. So response is gonna say you have a tool call. That's fine. I'm just gonna stop here and let's see the arguments. If I view the arguments, project ID 3, I set project Kraken, it is ID 3. Hours 1, working on weekend, and I said yesterday, so because the assistant has the context of what day is today, it knows how to calculate yesterday. So that's great. So I'm just gonna go and do that. And it says an hour has been successfully added to Project Kraken for yesterday. Actually gave me like a nice indication. Now, if I try to repeat this, my service has an error that doesn't allow you to add twice for the same day. So let's see. It's gonna say again, tool calls. It's fine. And I'm gonna put this here. So the our results was error bad request. I'm gonna send that back to the assistant and see what is the message is now. It says I apologize, but there was an error and could not add that. Now if my API had given a more descriptive error, then it would I could have sent it to the assistant to provide more input. But as it is, it's just being very apologetic and putting some nice wording around it. So that's it. That's how you use functions with your LLM and allow you to call your own APIs. I hope this was very, very helpful. When I discovered you could do this, it was thanks to a colleague of mine that created this system for us. And for me, it just opened a world of opportunities. As I said in the intro, we've been building APIs for many years for other systems to integrate with it. But now we can integrate with natural language with these APIs. And again, I feel that it opens a lot of opportunities. A few lessons learned when I was working on these demos and this talk. APIs and SDKs are changing very, very quickly. So be patient. When your SDK and model versions will make a difference. So if there are things that are not working and you're wondering why, just look at that. Optimizing system prompts and function definition is crucial, and also it will save you money. And I am a C# guy, and I think they've done a nice work with the API, but to be honest, it does seem like Python is a first-class citizen on all of this. A lot of the demos sometimes are in Python, so at the very least, learn to read Python and or use um, or use ChatGPT or Copilot to help you with that. Before I go, though, I did promise to talk about Assistant. So this came into preview when I was preparing for these demos, and finally it's available to me. So if you go into Assistant, you can see that it's a little bit like all the setup that we did, but with a UI. I could go here and say I'm gonna open one that I created earlier. You can see that I'll give it a name and it has its own ID. So when the client in the client, the new way of doing it would be that you request an instance of your assistant by providing the assistant ID. You create the instructions. This is kind of like the system message that you did, and then you set up the functions right here. You can see here that I have get projects, and it's very similar to what I have in the code. I would create one for add hours to projects, and then instead of having to send it with every call, the instance of your assistant will have it. So this is something that I think will be the future for this kind of implementation. So it is good to keep an eye on it. And with that, I hope that you have enjoyed this set of demos. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and I will make myself available. Have a great conference and enjoy all the other talks.